Good afternoon. I'm John Matea, President of the Goldwater Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation and Scholarship America, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. This webinar features Goldwater scholars who have pursued academic opportunities in the United Kingdom. We're delighted to be able to have these scholars share their experiences with you. About a year ago, 2018 Goldwater scholars and I began the development of Goldwater Community. Everyone agrees that there is much to be gained if Goldwater awardees help Goldwater awardees. Using Slack, we now have a way for Goldwater scholars and those who received honorable mentions to communicate with one another. If you are not already a Slack member, send me an email and we will send you an invitation to join. Today's webinar was organized by Matt Schoenbauer, Aaron Sandoval, and Daniela Morrow, the three Goldwater scholars who helped start the community. Aaron will be introducing our speakers and asking our speakers your questions, and Daniela will be closing the webinar and letting you know how to continue the conversation with our panelists on Slack. First, however, let me introduce Linda Zulsdorf and Laura Mickle from Scholarship America. They will tell you how you can take full advantage of today's webinar. Again, welcome to today's webinar, and we're sorry about the technical difficulties that we just experienced.
Hi, this is the Scholarship America team. I'm Linda Zulsdorf, Lead Program Manager, and I'm joined by Laura Mickle, who co-manages the program. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. As John mentioned, we will be here monitoring the chat function and selecting questions for the panelists to answer. Please submit your questions to us using the questions box on your screen. Later in the webinar, Aaron will ask panelists a few of your questions. We are also here for support. If you have any questions regarding GoToWebinar, please contact us via the chat function and we will try our best to assist you. Enjoy the webinar.
Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Sandoval and I'm a 2018 Goldwater Scholar from the University of Florida. I'm going to be telling you about each of the main UK academic fellowships for US students and then introducing our panelists. Because of the delay, the webinar will probably last until around 5:20 now. So it should still last around an hour. Sorry about that. So the four main scholarships that allow Americans to study in the United Kingdom for their graduate work are the Marshall Scholarship, the Rhodes Scholarship, the Gates-Cambridge Scholarship, and the Churchill Scholarship. The Marshall Scholarship allows students in the US to study at any UK institution for 1 to 3 years. Most students stay for 2 years and obtain 1 or 2 master's degrees. Marshall scholarships are mainly funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom and are intended to help strengthen the relationship between the American and British people. The Rhodes Scholarship is a postgraduate program for students around the world to study at the University of Oxford for 2 to 3 years. It was founded in 1902 by Cecil Rhodes, and students from all backgrounds are accepted based on their scholarly achievements, moral force of character, and energy to serve and lead. The Gates-Cambridge Scholarship was established by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the year 2000 and allows students from anywhere outside the UK to obtain a postgraduate degree from the University of Cambridge. Students are selected based on their intellectual ability, leadership potential, and a commitment to improving the lives of others. After the establishment of Churchill's College in Cambridge in the 1950s, the Churchill Scholarship was established in response to a request by Sir Winston Churchill of his American friends to create a way for young Americans to study there. The Winston Churchill Foundation now awards scholarships to 15 Americans every year to obtain a 1-year master's degree at Cambridge. Now, to introduce our panelists, all of whom have won a UK fellowship in addition to the Goldwater Scholarship or a Goldwater honorable mention. Bailey Weatherby was awarded the Gates-Cambridge Scholarship this February and will be obtaining a PhD in Physiology, Development, and Neuroscience at Cambridge. She's passionate about education access and science advocacy, and since 2014 has worked with Leading Youth Through Empowerment, a nonprofit that offers accelerated coursework to high-achieving at-risk youth. At Cambridge, she will be studying the post-implantation development of human and mouse embryos. John Liu is a 2018 Marshall Scholar and has just finished up his master's program in health policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and next year will be obtaining another master's in biological science at the Medical Research Council Lab of Molecular Biology at Cambridge. He is particularly interested in a class of infections known as neglected tropical diseases, which trap over 1 billion people in a cycle of poverty. John has taught a course on, studied the interventions against, and researched the biochemical bases of several infectious diseases. Connor Richards is a 2016 Gates-Cambridge Scholar. At Cambridge, he obtained a master's degree in applied mathematics and theoretical physics as a member of Churchill College. Connor focused academically on elementary particle physics, but after the political events of 2016 and getting to know an academically diverse set collection of scholars at Cambridge, he decided to move into politics. He now works as an applied data scientist at Civis Analytics, where he works on the effective use of political data to make positive change. Jacob Calvert is a 2015 Marshall Scholar and spent his years in Britain obtaining 2 master's degrees, the first in mathematics at the University of Bristol and the second in physics at the University of Oxford. When he applied for the Marshall, he was especially attracted to Bristol Center for Complexity Sciences, one of the world's few hubs of complex systems research. Jacob is now obtaining a PhD in statistics from the University of California, Berkeley. And finally, we have Kirk Smith, a 2017 Rhodes Scholar and second-year PhD student in electrochemical engineering at the University of Oxford. Kirk is passionate about developing the clean energy economy by advancing grid-scale energy storage. Outside of his thesis research on flow batteries, he competes as a long-distance runner. Now, each of the speakers will tell you a bit more about themselves. I don't see Bailey. Bailey, are you there? John, why don't you go ahead and... Oh, Bailey, is that you?
Yeah, sorry, the whole thing just crashed out for a second.
Okay,
I
no
just
worries.
had to reopen it. I think.
Go ahead and
Okay.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, Bailey.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bailey Weatherby. I just graduated from the University of Delaware. I was awarded the Gates Cambridge in February. When I was starting my PhD applications last year, I knew I wanted to stay generally in the field of developmental biology, and there was a research lab at Cambridge that I was really interested in, so I sent an application. And unlike the US, PhD programs in the UK usually don't guarantee funding, so the Gates was a really nice way for me to try to get around that and get some funding, and it was a good fit because the Gates really emphasizes their 4 main criteria, which is intellectual ability, a good academic fit with Cambridge, leadership potential, and a desire to better the lives of others. And those first 2 of that have to do with academics really come through when your department puts you forward as a Gates nominee, because each department gets a certain number that they can put forward to the foundation. But the leadership potential and the desire to help others is what I really tried to emphasize in my 500-word personal statement and in the short answer question. So I'm starting in September. I can't really speak to the experience there, but I'm really excited, and I can definitely answer questions about the application process, and I just did it.
Hi guys, I'm John again. I'm currently a Marshall studying in London right now, doing health policy, and I'm moving up to Cambridge next year. My motivation for coming to the UK to pursue some postgraduate studies is mainly that there's a plethora of different opportunities available here, and some of the programs are actually superior to the ones that can be offered in the US. In that sense, I saw the Marshall as an opportunity to learn something about health policy. I come from a basic science background, studying biochemistry and mathematics during undergraduate at Duke. So I'm completely new to the policy space, but it's been a great opportunity to come here and learn something about global health policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is one of the foremost institutions for studying global health in the world. But next year, I'll be going back to my basic science roots and studying biochemistry over at the Lab of Molecular Biology at the University of Cambridge. On the academics front, just to touch upon that briefly, I think the coursework itself has been a bit less intense and challenging than it was, at least for me during undergrad. But the benefit of that is that there's lots of free time to, say, have lots of fun, travel around the UK and the rest of Europe. And also, in some cases, in my case, I decided to take up a separate job at a vaccine development fund called CEPI, which raised about $750 million to develop vaccines for Ebola, Nipah virus, Lassa virus, and a bunch of other viruses that can cause epidemics, which is right down my alley. And ultimately, this opportunity could have only come as a result of being present in the UK and etc. So, but on the social life side of things, the Marshall has been great in the sense of you suddenly get 40 friends spread out all across the UK, friends that you can crash on their sofas if need be, and friends that you'll see throughout the year as a result of Marshall-sponsored events. So on the social life, time in the UK has been absolutely fantastic, and it's been a blast to suddenly have so many new friends, and it's been a fun time exploring this continent. I can also help answer any questions about the application process for Marshall if questions come up, but also happy to share more about my experience studying in the UK.
So I did Kirk, wait, are you telling me, can you guys hear me? We good? Okay, cool. So yeah, I did a year at Cambridge at Churchill College specifically on a GATES in 2017. I think Bailey did a great job again of laying out how the GATES application process works and sort of what the foundation looks for, and much better than I could do. So instead, I'll tell you sort of about my experience and how I found the UK. The GATES community is this really rich community of people studying all kinds of different fields, who all have like amazing stories, both about what they do in their academics and then outside of it. Some of the just most interesting people I've ever met. And also being at Churchill College was a great experience, and a lot of the people I hung out with in college, at least, were all Churchill scholars. There's a sort of a big group of like Americans and then some international students on a GATES at Churchill. So if folks have questions about the Churchill Scholarship, I can venture a guess at sort of answering those. But the community there was amazing. I feel like I learned as much outside of the classroom as I did in it, excuse me, which I think influenced my decision to sort of like pivot, and rather than continuing on with the PhD program I had planned to go to, I ended up deciding to leave that program. After I finished my master's, I went on to a PhD program, ended up deciding to leave that program and go get a job, as Aaron said, working in sort of like the political data space. And it was, this is sort of the first time in my like professional life that the work I've been doing has sort of had an immediate impact on things that I care about in like a tangible way that I can point to and say, I did this thing, which, coming from like a basic science research background, you know, the particle physics stuff that I was working on during my undergrad and starting my PhD was very interesting, but it's also very long time horizon work. And I think that like my time at Cambridge sort of really allowed me to like step back and think about the work I was doing and how it impacted the world around me, and sort of seeing a need or a call to action that compelled me ultimately to leave my field and switch and do something else. And I think that like that, you know, it was in that regard a very disruptive year, and I think in a great way. And I think that like, you know, the folks you're going to hear from today will tell you about sort of seizing the opportunity and making the most of that year. And I think, or multiple years if you're so fortunate. And I think that whatever that means for you, I would encourage you to make the most of that time in whatever shape that takes. Happy to talk more about stuff and answer questions. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I imagine there are many aspects of this UK Fellowships business that you're interested in. There's the motivation for applying, the process of applying, i.e. essays and interviews, the various options for the scholarships, like where you can go and what you can do there, and then how the scholarship affects your careers and your personal lives. And because I think the other scholars here have much more up-to-date info on the process of applying and the various options for the scholarships, I'd like to just say my motivation for applying and how the scholarship, at least in broad strokes, has influenced my career and personal life. So my motivation for applying was a practical one. During undergrad, the research I was doing, the courses I was taking, led me to develop an interest in math and physics, which I couldn't fully realize during my time in undergrad. I studied bioengineering. And so I thought that the best way to do that was by going to the UK and rolling into the current work I was doing some aspects of the math and physics that I wanted to study. And I thought that this was a better option than pursuing a traditional master's program in the US, or by jumping into a PhD program that I didn't think I was ready for. And so this was a good option for me. And there was a dedicated research hub for the kind of questions I was interested in at the University of Bristol. So that was an easy choice. And then once I was there, there was other work I wanted to do that was best realized at Oxford, so I went there next. And so the primary things that I gained from my scholarship, during the time I was at Bristol, I had a mentor there who basically identified right away the kind of work that I was interested in doing that I had had a hard time articulating myself. And so from that point on, I felt very motivated, very dedicated, and was able to pursue that work during my 2 years there. And in fact, that's the same kind of work I'm doing now in a PhD program. So it was pivotal to my career to go have this experience in the UK. And I benefited more broadly than just my career. My personal life was dramatically affected by this. I got a big new group of friends. I had never been outside the US before going to the UK, and so I got to travel around and see a lot of things. I got to drink a lot of cider, and I had a really nice time. Unexpectedly, I would say that the process itself of applying for one of these fellowships was very valuable to me. It gave me a chance to reflect on my childhood and my undergrad experiences and my hopes, and to roll that into an application. And that was valuable to me in a way which goes beyond just the winning of the scholarship. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested to go through this process, because it will benefit you in ways other than just what you get from the scholarship. Thanks.
All right, there we go. Hope you guys can hear me. My name's Kirk. I'm a second year PhD student at Oxford, working in a battery research group. So I'm in the engineering department there, doing more chemical engineering type work. Previously at Tulsa, I did more mechanical engineering type work. And at Tulsa, I was an honorable mention for the Goldwater in 2017, which was the spring of my junior year going into senior year. I had applied to that and the UDAL and a few more scholarships, and I got the honorable mention on the Goldwater and then rejected from everything else. And so I was not going into fall of senior year with the most confidence. And my sort of application goals, or my goals for the fall of senior year was getting into a PhD program, because all I really knew at that time was that I liked research and I wanted to keep doing it. And it seemed like I would be able to find funding for a PhD, so I wanted to do that through any means possible. And the scholarship advisor at my university told me about this sort of suite of UK fellowships, which at the time I wasn't well aware of. And she motivated me to apply for them and think about applying for them the summer before, around this time of going into my senior year in undergrad. And she basically said, they're very competitive, but you have as good a shot as any, and they're good practice, and because the deadlines are before things like the GRFP, they'll force you to do all your last minute procrastination before the GRFP, which is one that has more, there's more money to go around. So that was my main goal. My main sites were set on the GRFP. I was like, okay, these things will be draft personal statements and whatnot. So I ended up applying to a few. The only one that was successful was the Rhodes. And so I knew at that point, November, where I was going to be going for the next year. The Rhodes is just a 2-page personal statement. I think you can have like 5 up to 8 references. And then there's there's an interview round if you get selected for that. As far as the actual PhD over here, UK PhDs are a lot different than US ones, and it depends on if they're a CDT or a regular PhD. Also at Oxford, they're called DPhils, which is kind of strange, but basically, if you come, I came over with just a bachelor's, and so I basically skipped a master's, and there's no courses required for my PhD. So I just showed up in the lab day one, started working, and it really depends on your PI. That's true with any PhD, but it can be a little unsettling just when there's absolutely no coursework involved at all and you just start research. CDTs, on the other hand, are basically a year of coursework that's more equivalent to a one-year master's. So just look into that when you're applying. Also, UK PhDs are faster, so depending on what you want to do after, that could be a pro or a con. For me, I know at this point that I just want to do research. I don't necessarily care as much which role, so the shorter timeline was good from my perspective. And as far as road specific things that I've experienced since coming here, the Rhodes isn't known for being as heavy on STEM. And so I got exposed to a lot of different viewpoints. And I'm not as aware of the culture in other scholarship communities, but it was interesting being around a very opinionated sort of culture, and it can be somewhat argumentative, but it's good and I like it, and it's certainly opened my eyes to a lot of different things. So yeah, I'm here for the question. So thanks for your time.
All right, thanks everybody. So I'll be moderating the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Please send any questions that you have into the chat box, and I'll try to direct them to our speakers. If your question is directed at a particular speaker, please indicate this. Otherwise, the questions will be open to any of the speakers to answer. I will say that we've already received quite a few questions, so I apologize in advance if we're unable to address all the questions. So I'll start with the few questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. So the first question is open to any of the speakers to answer. So many of the scholarships stress both academic excellence and quality of character. In your essays and interviews, how did you try to integrate the two of these together?
For me, there were two parts of my application. There was the part that went to my department, and this is for the Gates, for the Physiology, Development, and Neuroscience department, and then there was the part that existed just for the Gates Cambridge Trust. For my department, I wrote specifically about my science, my research, what I had done, and for my PhD, I actually had to write a 2-page research proposal for what I would do for my PhD, which, again, there's no classes traditionally for a UK PhD, so you actually apply in with a lab, with a supervisor, and with a general idea of a project. So all of my actual academic stuff was in with my application to my department, which if the department decides to send that application to the Gates Cambridge Trust, they get that too. So in the space that was for the Gates Cambridge specifically, I emphasized much more my extracurricular activities, the aspects of myself that I think are really formative to the way that I think about the world, and the ideas of leadership potential and a desire to help others. And I tried to connect that to my research in a way to say, like, my research matters to me because I have these goals, but beyond that, this translates into other things such as like science advocacy and education access work. And then in my interviews, I did similar things, but those were much more directed questions about either my work or my extracurriculars.
Any of the other speakers have anything to add to that?
I would just add, we can. I would just say, okay, I was good. Just that I guess like I think that I wasn't. Aaron's question is a very intelligent question, and it sort of frames the application process in a good way. And I think I maybe wasn't as intentional about like the thinking about ways in like my essays interview to sort of like frame my character. One thing I sort of just leaned into is a lot of science outreach experience that I had, both like throughout undergrad and then like in my senior year, I managed to get a grant to start up like an outreach program in the local community around my undergrad. And so I sort of like, rather than pull on sort of like different places to try and like talk about my character or like things outside of the classroom. I sort of like leaned on that consistent interest, and it's also was like focused around like this international like science outreach program that I was like getting money to start up a version of locally. So that sort of like the thing I leaned on. So I think like that's an example of, one sort of like dedicated interest that kind of served as my main like extracurricular activity that I talked about in both essays and interviews.
Yeah, and the only thing I want to add is just to say that for me and maybe many of you, I thought that my application would be stronger on those technical things and might be a little bit more lacking on the softer side of things. And so I wrote an extremely personal statement. And I think for many of you with your background, I don't think there will be any question as to your legitimacy as a STEM person. I think that will show through. And so I encourage you to maybe pepper in more of the personal side of things, more of how your extracurriculars speak to your character than you might otherwise.
And just to add another thought, don't forget the power of stories and telling stories about the activities that you've done, specific instances that exemplify certain characteristics. And ultimately, think about the essays as the opportunity to sort of plot a few points on this graph, and what your essay wants, what you should really be striving for in your essays, to draw a line of best fit through all the opportunities and experiences that you've had. And ideally, you want to also show where that line of best fit ultimately leads, which is where you one day hope to become.
All right, thanks everybody. So the next question we have asks, how did you guys juggle applying for UK fellowships, PhD or graduate programs, and PhD or graduate fellowships such as the NSF GRFP?
Okay, yeah. So like I sort of said earlier, I was motivated to apply to the UK fellowships because a lot of the deadlines seemed to be before GRFP, which was even before regular grad school. So I just created a spreadsheet that had all of my deadlines and then just worked sort of sequentially. And I was really lucky to get the roads because it meant I had less work on my plate because I could just stop. But yeah, and I just kept track of all the people that I wanted to write references, and just because you have to, sometimes with academics, you have to remind them a few times. So that was the main thing, was just, I think I sat down in August and really tried to, that was when I started drafting the personal statements. But just the fact that you guys are in this webinar now, you'll be thinking about it. That's good. It just kind of takes a couple of times of just sitting there and trying to like really work it out. But you'll find that a lot of these things overlap, and you can pull things from certain applications and use them elsewhere, and then sort of like craft a story that starts to make sense as you kind of continue on. So.
All right, thank you. So this next question is specifically for John and Jacob because it pertains to the Marshall Scholarship. So they ask, for someone who wants a research-based career, would it be ill-advised to apply for 2 taught degrees rather than research degrees if those taught degrees are a good fit?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, given that if you're going to make this your career, then you'll do a PhD and you'll have an awful lot of time to do research work. And especially if you're going into an area which has an extremely high bar of technical knowledge, which is needed even to do the most basic things, taking 2 taught courses can actually be really good preparation. Like a lot of people do the part 3 math. I think that's what Connor did. And basically, if you want to do something like astrophysics and you're in the UK, like basically everybody goes through that program. And in fact, maybe they could even use another one. Yeah.
And also think about the opportunity of the Marshall to also explore fields that are outside of your immediate area of expertise. Your academic career will last decades, hopefully, after the end of your PhD. And during that time, you really won't have opportunities to learn about some policy fields that you were once interested in or whatnot, because at that point you'll be hopefully at least you'll be asked to help develop some of the policy, and it would be useful to have some background in those areas. So in summary, think of it as an investment in the future.
Thanks. So we've had several questions actually asking how much contact did you have with professors or other scholars at the institutions that you ended up at before you submitted your application. And one of these questions was directed specifically towards Bailey, but there was another question asking everyone in general. So Bailey, could you give us your thoughts?
So for me, again, I applied in with a lab and with a PI. So understanding that your PI is what makes your PhD and your lab is what makes your PhD, and you can't one of these fellowships, and that's really great, but if you don't like what you're doing and who you're working with, you're not going to be happy. I actually flew to Cambridge last August, and I sat down and I met with 5 different PIs and graduate students in the lab and talked to them, got a feel. I wanted to face-to-face see how these people behaved, how I felt like we would get along. And that's when I decided who I was sending my application with. Thankfully, the person that I was really interested in and I got along really well, and she wanted to have me in the lab. So I had a lot of contacts, and I actually think that helped me a lot, because when I sent my application, I know that Magda was going and asking people questions about, like, why hasn't Bailey heard this yet? Why hasn't Bailey heard that yet? She emailed me when the department put my application forward, and she asked the Gates Cambridge Foundation when I would hear things. And when I went in my interview, I could sit down, and one of my interviewers was someone who knew her and knew her work, and I could sit there and say to them, yes, I'm serious about this. I am a good fit with Cambridge. I've been there. I've seen these things. These are the things that I like about it. I think that that's an extreme example. I do think that it helped me out. Every single person that was at the Gates Cambridge interview, because most of us go to DC or Seattle, I think it's been in the past too, all of them at least Skyped with them. Again, I had to write a research proposal, so I had help with that. So definitely, if you are thinking about applying for like the Gates or for any PhD in the UK, reach out to faculty for sure.
Anyone else have anything to add to that?
I would just tack on, sorry, Kirk, I'll just be quick, that like, I think that answer, I think Bailey's exactly right for a PhD, but if you're applying for a master's, especially a taught master's in my case, like Jacob was right, I did part 3. So I didn't have any contact at the university before applying. But again, I think that like, if it were for a PhD, you would certainly have more, but for a taught master's, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you haven't really had contact.
Before I submitted the personal statement, I had gone through a few departments and looked at a lot of PIs and found a few that were really interesting to me, and I reached out to those via email, and a couple responded, but essentially what I pitched to them was like, hey, I'm applying to this scholarship which would give me funding to your university. I'm really interested in your work. If I were to get this, would you be willing to let me work in your lab? And so that's basically like, look, I could bring funding and I could be a free student. Also, I've done some stuff that's actually real. So you kind of sell it to them, and then they're sort of can be motivated to reply and say, like, give you some sort of affirmative level. So I don't think in my application necessarily I named any groups, but once I found out I had an interview, I did follow up with them and have a little in-depth discussion of what I might end up doing. But I definitely went through the submission process with an idea of who I wanted to work with, but I don't think necessarily wrote about that, named specific people per se. Not to say that you can't, but.
So for the Rhodes, do you have to apply to Oxford along with the fellowship application, or is the fellowship application separate from your application to the Oxford academic program?
It's separate. So I also applied to Gates, and I remember having to apply to a program first, and then like I think they had to admit you and then sponsor you for it. which is different. So Rhodes, you just apply to Rhodes, and then you say what program you want to do, and then if you get it, then you actually apply to the program through the internal system. Yeah.
That's definitely, I think, a big difference between them. Because for the GATES, you have to be admitted to the department before you're even considered for the scholarship.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Which also I'll say I applied for the GATES and I withdrew from it after I got the Rhodes, but I had been admitted to a really cool program that I was really excited about. So potentially it could be a foot in the door, even if it doesn't work out. So, and then once you're in the door, it's easier to find more sources of funding. But like Bailey said, funding in the UK is harder to come by, especially for American non-EU students.
Thanks. So the next question that we have is directed towards Connor. It's asking, can you talk more about your decision to transition from theoretical physics to data science? And then more generally, if anyone can answer this, if you guys know any scholars who might have done work in one field or one area during their undergraduate and then transition to something different for their UK fellowship, and if that's possible for students who might want to switch lanes when they go to the UK.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to talk about my transition, rather than talking about like from one field to another, is sort of to say like that I was sort of sitting there in the UK watching, and again, I was over there during like the November 2016 election, and then like everything that happened afterwards, and was sort of sitting there, and again, imagine being surrounded by some Americans, but also a bunch of people from Europe and the rest of the world who are sort of looking at you and trying to make sense of what's happening in your country while you're abroad, and also processing that and like, you know, answering it for yourself and then sort of like answering them and like, oh, so this is actually what's going on. And so I got to a point where I was sort of very interested in doing something more political. I had started talking with some other people who all were various science backgrounds. Some were more policy focused, some were more pure science, some were like biomedical engineers who had like had one or two startups at this point because they were finishing their PhDs. But we started working on this like, you know, like nonpartisan science, like nonprofit that was like trying to you know, increase like science and like I don't know, I guess like visibility of science and like, you know, work with like candidates to make science more of a priority, and which sounds similar to this thing that 314 Action is doing, which as we were talking about this, someone was like, hey, look, someone's doing this cool thing. We're like, oh shit, that's what we were, excuse me, I shouldn't curse. We're like, oh, that was actually what we were trying to do. So, you know, that was sort of my like segue into thinking more about politics and actually being interested. And then I eventually got to the point where I wanted to move into politics and said, okay, as a person with a physics and math background, what can I do to be useful to campaigns? And I figured like my plan F was to like go knock doors as an organizer. And I tried to like, you know, what can I do that leverages my knowledge in a better way, and landed on doing data science for campaigns, which is really cool and rewarding. And I think a natural extension of like the sort of like big data things that you're exposed to in like high energy physics. Yeah, all that to say, it was more the choice of field driving, or the choice of area, rather than like I want to go into data science. But it was a pretty natural transition once I had that worked out.
Yeah, and I'll just say that it was the case that I had a different degree from undergrad and did two totally different things, both of which I was arguably unqualified to be doing in the UK. And there's a lot to say about that, so you can find me in the UK Fellowship Slack if you'd like to talk in more granularly about that.
Thank you. So we've had a few questions as well on letters of recommendation, how to solicit them, from whom to solicit them, and then if you should provide a personal statement or essays before soliciting that letter of recommendation, and when you should solicited recommendations. So if you guys have any advice at all on letters of recommendation, please share it with us.
Well, clearly all of you guys have won at least the Goldwater, received an honorable mention for that. And back, I think, well, at least in my year, it was 2 recommendation letters they had to submit, if not 3. So in that sense, for the Marshall, you only submit 4, which is 2 extra ones. So in my case, I made sure that there was a balance between people who could speak about my academics and also people who could speak about my extracurricular involvement, and ideally people who could do both. It's a bit different for other scholarships, and I'll let the other folks speak about those.
I just want to make a note that these letters don't have to be written each in a vacuum. When I asked for recommendation letters, I specifically told my letter writers who the other letter writers were and what I had asked them to write about. So I asked them specifically to write about a particular aspect of their interactions with me so that I could, piece together the full mosaic. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Don't be afraid to tell them something more specific about what you hope that they can say about your time together.
One thing I want to say, which Kirk touched on a lot, I think in a really good way, is like using these fellowships as sort of a dry run or like a way to get you to prepare for your GRFP or PhD programs, whatever it is that you're applying for. And I think like that goes for letter writers as well, because of the kind of letters that you are needed or that one could get for a fellowship like Marshall, Gates, etc. When those get submitted to PhD programs, right, I think it's generally like more detail and stronger and sort of like has had more work done on it than would be normal. And so I think that like using that as a chance to sort of build up strong letters, knowing that, for example, like the three of the sort of like subfield letters that I had for my applications just went straight into my PhD program applications. And I think were like a real boost to my application because these people, were somehow persuaded to say nice things about me that I think resonated with committees. One other thing that I would add is just in asking for letters of recommendation, leaning on the like, can you write a strong letter of recommendation is a good thing, because that gives someone who might like you and might think you're great but not have much to say a way in a non-combative way to say, no, I don't think I can. I don't think I can give you the letter you need. And with that in mind, also don't always be open to someone who wants to write you a strong letter, someone who I had sort of like, I had in my mind, like I had the letters I needed. And this professor who I took classes with in my junior year towards the end, we were like talking, and because I asked him like, oh, would you write a strong letter? He then like told me the letter he would write, and I went, oh, I should ask him for a letter because that's a really good letter. So right, you could always have more good letters, and you can find out how strong someone's thinking about writing one by saying, could you write a strong letter?
I think also be really clear about the expectations and what each thing you're asking for a letter for is looking for. So for the Gates, they have those 4 criteria. I know for the Rhodes and the Marshall, they also have their own sort of goals. Ask your letter writers to write towards those goals, to keep that in mind, structure it around that, because these people are reading so many letters and so many applications. Lay it out for them easy. It's like, I know you're looking for information about this and this and this and this, and here it is. And that also goes for NSF too, because for the GRFP, you are graded on 2 categories, broader impact and intellectual merit. And those 2 main ideas translate to these pretty well too. The other thing specifically for the Gates is, again, it's tied into your actual application. So you're going to want 3 letters that goes to your academic department, so probably within your subfield. But the 4th letter is your Gates Cambridge reference. And that person is expected to know a lot about the foundation and the Gates in general and what exactly they're looking for. And it says that on the application. Make sure that that's true. For me, that was our scholarships advisor. And for a lot of people, it tends to be the person of contact at the school is generally expected to be the one to write your Gates reference.
I just want to say one thing. Sorry, Aaron, just to speaking of scholarship advisor, I want to like shout out / like suggest that like my scholarship advisor was the hero when it came to making sure my letters were all good and up to snuff. I never actually read a single one of them. She just went back, like to this day, I've never read them. She just went back and forth with the letter writers and made sure that like, and worked with them to make sure that they had, you know, letters of requisite length and depth, and like iterated on it with them and took care of that for me. So like if you can have a good relationship with your scholarship advisor so that they can help facilitate that, I think that is a great way to have someone advocating for you with those letter writers who might really like you and want to say good things, but also are academics and like busy and think that, you know, they can just write something up quickly. And so if you have someone to help drive that along, yeah.
Thanks. So the
And if
next
you're
question.
thinking about things now, ask your letter writers over the summer. Like start asking them right now.
Okay. So the next question is, how did successfully applying for the Goldwater scholarship maybe help you during the process of applying for a UK fellowship? And did having the Goldwater scholarship, you think, impact your application when you were sending in applications to UK fellowships?
I think it helps. I think having to have written like a personal research statement was like a good dry run of like knowing how to collect your thoughts and organize those ideas. And also like it looks good on the CV. There's a whole thing, awards begets awards. So it helps because it shows like, oh, this other really prestigious organization thought they were good enough. So this is definitely a person that we should pay attention to potentially.
Right. Anything else to add, guys?
For me, there you go. Okay. For me, the Gates was the first real application that I really put the first one of undergraduate where I put a really lot of time and was like invested in my research proposal. And I think it was just like a really good practice. And all the other applications I wrote for things that I did not get were all great when it came to the UK fellowships, because I was expecting those to be just even more practice for like hopefully the PhDs. So I just think like the more you write, the better you get, the more you can piece it together and it adds up. So.
Connor, were you going to say something?
No, I was just saying it helps. I think Bailey and Kirk both said all that needs to be said.
Okay. So a question that we've gotten a few times actually is, what were your main motivations in going to the United Kingdom as opposed to staying in the U.S. and going to a program in the U.S.? What were the things that pulled you to the United Kingdom, and what went into your decision whenever you were deciding on going to the UK?
I think for me, I'll answer. Oh, sorry.
Ahead.
Okay, my answer is easy. It's just that there's not an analogous program to something like Part 3 math in the U.S. And so like if that was a program that I was interested in trying to do, and trying being the operative word. So the draw to the UK was just that there wasn't that analog of a program in the US, which is something I think I've also heard from like John. But yeah, that's my answer.
My draw to the UK was to have the opportunity of working with this one PI over at Cambridge. He's the world-renowned expert in the particular sub-area of structural biology that I'm interested in. Stanford, for instance, now has a bunch of microscopes that can approximate what the capacity at the LMB is, but it's still nowhere near the capacity that Cambridge has. And as a result, for instance, I was a few months ago, I was contemplating whether or not to leave the UK a year ahead of schedule and just begin my MD PhD at Stanford, where I would be doing work towards a PhD, towards finishing school in the area of interest. But ultimately, I decided to stay in the UK in order to have the opportunity to work with this one particular PI that I've now been in contact with for nearly 3 years.
Anything else to add, guys?
I actually applied to like TED programs in the US. There were a lot of really great people in my field all over. And I was actually at Caltech getting ready for a day of 6 interviews when they contacted me and said, "You've been awarded the Gates. You have 2 days to tell us if you accept it." So I actually had to make a decision to withdraw 10 applications to accept the Gates before being, and I got interviews for all 10 schools. So it was a really hard decision to make. And I think what it came down to for me was the PhD was shorter. I actually did almost a full master's like coursework here at UD. Like I took a lot of graduate level coursework, so I felt prepared for it. I didn't feel as if I necessarily needed to sit through more graduate level coursework, so there were no classes. It was faster. And like I said before, Magda and I had talked a lot. She sat on Skype with me for 40 minutes to prepare me for my Gates interview. Like she seemed really committed to me as a person. And my project is studying mouse and human post-implantation development. And her lab is the only one in the world that can, she actually is the lab that figured out how to culture human post-implantation development, which is not something that the US government will fund, so there's no NIH funding for human embryo work. So that combination of things helped me make a decision. Also, I was at Caltech and I had an interview that day, and one of her best friends was actually one of my interviewers and had been told that day that I had been awarded the Gates that morning. So I walked into her office and she told me she was supposed to be recruiting me, but she told me to accept the Gates anyway, and that kind of helped a lot. So yeah.
Awesome.
For me, the UK fellowships were more of an opportunity to pivot and do something a little bit different. Whereas in the UK or in the US, when I was looking at programs, I was more sort of forced to stay limited to stuff that I had done on, and that was like a natural extension of my research. Where even within the like STEM, I could probably change more than I could in the US. But I know a lot of people over here on multiple scholarships that like some of the people in this panel that have switched fields entirely. And so the UK stuff sort of allows you to sort of craft your statement and convince the reviewers why you want to do that, where there's not really in the US. It's a little harder to do that and to make those kinds of switches.
So the next question that you guys have is, how do you feel that your receipt of such a distinguished fellowship has enabled you to further your research pursuits and perhaps career opportunities going forward? Has it opened any doors perhaps, or maybe not?
In my case, it has. After undergrad, I worked at a venture capital fund for the summer before beginning my time in the UK, and I didn't apply for it. The dude who ran the fund happened to be a Rhodes from way back when, and he needed some people to help out with the firm he was running. So that was a really cool opportunity that I would otherwise would not have possibly received.
Yeah, I have a hard time sort of distinguishing between those aspects where, I guess between aspects like that and aspects which are like more core to like the research I do now. It was so influential that it almost seems dishonest to like pick a small piece of it. It has opened doors, and but I think that the more valuable thing has been like the change in worldview I had when I was in the UK. Like the time spent there, you won't believe how valuable that time is, just to talk to lots of other people who have these sparkling intellects and have had such different experiences. It just changes your world. And so sure, it's opened doors and very immediate things. Like I've been working with a company that's all people that were on these scholarships, and I only met them through this. So it's opened doors in that way, but more fundamentally, it changes things.
Yeah, I just want to tack on to what Jacob said, because I think that his answer framed the question differently in my mind, because it was difficult for me to sort of answer this from the perspective of like, what doors has the Gates opened, because it opened doors so far back and so early on, right? That like I think I wouldn't have even been considering like changing fields, right? Had I not been there and had that experience and been around the people that like shaped those interests. So I think like it has, but there are both things I could point to of like doors it has opened of like people that, you know, like, I don't know, like headhunters from like quant firms that want to take you out to lunch because they're like, oh, you know, you did a Gates, you probably like, you can come work for me. Which like when you're a grad student and you know, like free food is free food, yeah, sure, why not? But I think like also fundamentally it's changed, yeah, like my entire career trajectory and like the path that I'm going. So I think like I think these are like transformative experiences, and the way that they transform your life varies from person to person and what that looks like. But I think like, yeah, there are like, you know, big impacts.
All right, so the last question actually is one of my own questions. So the reason we started this Goldwater Scholar community, it was kind of modeled off of a lot of the scholar communities that exists for the UK fellowships. So if you guys could just talk a little bit about that aspect of winning the fellowship, I guess the community that you were incorporated into being awarded a UK fellowship.
I can go. I will just cut myself off because I could gush for a while about the Gates community. It's awesome because you both have these both people in your college who are, you know, also on Gates who you can spend time with, but there's a common room that like has a free coffee machine. It's not the best coffee, Bailey, but you'll like it. It's got like free coffee. And like that's a great place. It like overlooks the river and it's like really nice place to like go and sit in these nice like windows where you can like study, talk to people. So that kind of like having a common room and things like that really helps build community. And just like it's just this really warm community of a lot of like extremely brilliant people. And one of the things that they do is they take you up for like your orientation. You go up to the Lake District, up to Ambleside, which like, yeah, Bailey, it's like, that's an amazing experience. You're gonna have so much fun. I wish I could go to Ambleside again. It's great. So I think like that is one thing that I'm really grateful towards the Gates for, is like the ways in which they're very deliberate about helping build community with their scholars. And there's also like, you know, when Bailey was in DC interviewing, I was at the British Embassy like that night for like a reception where they have like the alumni come. And so like there are both like during your scholarship year and then afterwards, there are some like cool things that the Gates has done. And also while I'm being recorded, I want to say that the whole Goldwater Scholar community is awesome. This is like such a cool thing that I wish we had back when I was an undergrad. So cool. This is amazing. Thanks to the folks that set this up.
Anything else to add, guys? All right, so we've come to the end of our webinar.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I want to just piggyback off of that in terms of the Goldwater community. I do want to say that one of the things that really helped me prep for my interview is Oyan Mandal, who's in the Goldwater Slack. He had posted about his Gates, and I actually had messaged him asking if he had any advice, and he sent me a like 5-page document going over his interview, and I had the same interviewers that he did, and it honestly helped me prep so much. So I actually made one. So if anyone wants that, let me know. It goes through everything.
I also have one for the Chicago region for Marshall. I have a compilation of ones from like 10 years, so let me know.
I also have one from the New York region of Marshall, if you guys are interested.
All right, so do you guys have any other closing thoughts before we close out? Anything you guys want to say before the end of the webinar?
Apply.
Yeah, do it.
Apply, ask us for help. We'll help. As you've seen, we've applied to these. We like to talk. We'll give you advice.
All right. Thank you so much.
Slack
So
also has a call function, by the way, guys, if you guys ever want to call any of us, or call me at least. Happy to give some words of advice.
awesome. So I'll go ahead and do the ending spiel now. Our time today has come to an end, but the conversation can still continue. We have a channel on our Slack called UK Fellowships, where you can continue to ask questions and discuss the Marshall, Rhodes, Gates, Cambridge scholarships, and more. There are already many scholars on this channel, including past recipients of UK Fellowships, and even some who are not on the panel today. I hope that all of you and all of our panelists will join us on the channel today and in the coming days. Many thanks to all of our speakers. We truly appreciate the time and experiences you have shared with us. Many of us will be applying to these prestigious and competitive fellowships, so your advice and insights are truly invaluable to us. Finally, I would like to share some Goldwater Scholar Community news. We are planning more webinars in the future. Our next webinar is this fall. It will cover graduate school applications, so keep an eye out for further information in the coming months. We are also making some exciting progress in sharing the incredible accomplishments of the Goldwater Scholars. We are currently working on producing a series of Goldwater Scholar spotlights for our upcoming Goldwater social media profiles, as well as publishing a Goldwater book series through Springer. In addition to this, we are also planning a Goldwater National Meetup at the National Conference on Undergraduate Research in April of 2020 at Montana State University. If you are interested in being featured in the spotlight on social media or would like to express your interest in the national meetup, please fill out the survey that Matt sent out on Monday if you have not already. And before we go, I wanted to just thank everybody who made this event possible. Dr. Mateja, Matt, who you didn't get to see, Daniela, who unfortunately did not get to see for technical difficulties, everyone else who helped us on the Goldwater Council. Thank you as well to Laura and Linda from Scholarship America. And finally, thank you once again to the panelists and everyone who attended this webinar tonight. Have a great evening.
Thanks.